Hello and welcome to Monday in Parliament, our look at the day at Westminster. The headlines: Labour asks for reassurances over the troubled child sex abuse inquiry.
Where is the Home Secretary, and why is it that nobody from the government has sought to proactively come to this House?
The government insists no further changes will be made for women born in the 1950s whose state pension comes in later than they'd expected. And a grim assessment on the state of the modern world in the House of Lords.
As far as I'm concerned, I think we're living in the most troublesome times I can think of in my lifetime, having lived both through the war and also during the confrontation with Russia.
But first, MPs have been told to get behind the troubled independent inquiry into child sex abuse. A Labour MP asked an urgent question of the Home Secretary after a group representing survivors walked away from the process, criticising the leadership of Professor Alexis Jay, who was appointed after the resignation of a New Zealand judge, Dame Lower Goddard. When a Home Office minister responded for the government, the questioner, Lisa Nandy, was unimpressed.
Where is the Home Secretary, and why is it that nobody from the government has sought to proactively come to this House and provide reassurance about the serious events that have unfolded over the last week as this inquiry has unravelled in front of our eyes? Has the Home Secretary met survivors groups since last Thursday, and what steps has she taken to establish that the Chair and the panel have the expertise and the working relationships for this to succeed? Has anybody from the Home Office investigated why so many lawyers have cited concerns about competency and leadership? Does she expect further resignations, and has a new Chief Legal Counsel been appointed?
I'm absolutely delighted, as the Minister responsible for vulnerability, safeguarding and counter-extremism, to be here to answer this question. It is absolutely at the core of this government's priority to safeguard children in our country. The Home Secretary was in this House as recently as October the 17th answering questions in detail. The Home Affairs Select Committee has asked detailed questions of the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office. The Honourable Lady is really quite wrong in asserting that there's some sort of smokescreen and hiding behind independence. It's absolutely essential that this inquiry is an independent inquiry. The terms of reference of this inquiry were shaped with the voices and the opinions of the victims, and it's very important that this independence is maintained.
I've acted in a number of criminal cases in which I have seen with my own eyes the terrible consequences for adults of what happened to them as children. But I want to ask her a question from a slightly different angle. I have a constituent who, since the early part of this century, has been left in a hideous Kafkaesque limbo. He does not know whether he is an accused person, whether he is a witness, what is his status in relation to this inquiry. And he, like the victims, needs to be told when this is all going to finish, both for him and for the victims. Would my honourable friend please make some inquiries of the inquiry to ensure that this man can either be prosecuted or set free?
Well, I can understand why he wants to bring this matter to a swift conclusion on behalf of his constituent. These are operational matters for the police, and of course, quite rightly, they are independent of the Home Office.
This inquiry is on its fourth chair. Every time ministers have come to the House and asserted that the current chair is the right person to take the inquiry forward, for the fourth time of saying that, why do they expect this House, the public, and above all the survivors to be reassured? Of course, as the Minister has said, this is an independent inquiry, in particular as to its conduct and its findings. But that doesn't mean the Home Office can take no responsibility at all.
Can she tell us when she anticipates that a suitable legal counsel will be appointed to ensure the facts are well established throughout the proceedings? Following the resignation of the previous chair in August, does she know whether internal procedures for resolving complaints about staff and panel members have now been established? And most importantly, and this is categorically not an operational matter, what does the Minister plan to do to restore trust in the proceedings for those survivors of sexual abuse and to regain their support?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her series of questions, and to take the last the last point first, in terms of confidence, I think there's a huge amount that we can do in this House, and that is actually to get behind the inquiry. It is open for business. And I think it's worth getting in perspective that while I'm disappointed that one victims group has decided not to engage with the inquiry at the current time, and that's really disappointing that that's the case, but I am hopeful that they will re-engage in the future. We must remember it is one, and the inquiry is open for business.
The Home Office Minister Sarah Newton there. The government has told the Commons that women born in the 1950s who find themselves caught short by changes to the state pension scheme can always rely on the benefit system. The group, called WASPI, or Women Against State Pension Inequality, says there wasn't enough time or notice given before raising their state retirement age. With the autumn statement in sight, MPs who've campaigned on the issue looked for a change in tone from the ministers at the Department for Work and Pensions. There didn't seem to be one.
The government will not be introducing further transitional protection beyond the £1.1 billion already in place. Going any further could not be justified, given the underlying imperative must be to focus public resources on those most in need.
Diana Johnson.
It's a very disappointing response from the Minister. There's 10,000 WASPI women in Hull, and with 4,100 names, Hull had the largest WASPI petition presented to this House last month. Labour has suggested changes to pension credit, which can be financed by clawing back handouts to the wealthiest to help these women. Isn't it about time the Minister understood that these WASPI women are not going to go away until justice is done and they get a fair deal?
Yeah. Well, as the Honourable Lady's mentioned, Labour proposed using the pension credit as a transition mechanism for helping these women. This was discussed extensively in the course of the bill that went through Parliament on this subject, and it was decided that £1.1 billion alternatively would be used as transition relief.
As long as I have got women, like my constituent Gillian Purcell, who come to me and say at 60, I've worked all my life, but my body's telling me I can't do it anymore. Without a pension, when will this government do the honourable thing and start looking after the WASPI women? Yeah.
Well, the cost of reversing the changes varies depending on who one asks, Mr. Speaker. The different political groups have come up with different amounts, which actually vary between £7 billion and £30 billion.
I recently spoke to a constituent who was working in a care home, who was incredibly distressed at the thought of having to work another 7 years in what is an increasingly physically demanding job, especially after having made her retirement plans to look after her daughter's children so that her daughter could go back to work. What assessment has his department made of the implications not only for the women affected, but for their families too? Yeah.
Well, as the Honourable Lady has implied, the Department has considered this long and hard, and the current average age of exit from the Labour Party for women is 63.1, well above the previous women's SPA of 60.
I just wanted to make it clear it's not just on that side of the House that there are concerns about this. Well, of course, we don't know what the autumn statement will say tomorrow, but I do think we ought to at least keep options open to look at this, because it's not very satisfactory, the current state of affairs.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, public finance is very complicated. I know he intends to wait until Wednesday to hear what the Chancellor has to say, but I can tell him that this has been looked at long and hard. Transition arrangements of more than £1.1 billion have been put in place, and the state pension age was discussed and enacted in 1995 to change. There's been further acts of Parliament, and all this has been extensively discussed.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that reverting to the 1995 state pension timetable would cost something in the region of £39 billion. Does the Minister agree with me that it's easy to criticise the government over this policy, but more difficult to explain where the money would come from for any policy changes?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I totally agree with him.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, does my honourable friend agree with me that the difficulty with the Labour proposal on pension credit is that that is actually not what is sought by the WASPI campaign? What is sought by them goes right back to the 1995 Act, would almost certainly be illegal under the rules of fair progress for both sexes on pensions, and would cost an absolute fortune.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that question. I totally agree with him. And one of the honourable gentlemen on the other side was shouting, "Tell that to the destitute." Well, we have got a very good benefit system in this country, and those people that are destitute, I'm sure, are very familiar with that.
Richard Harrington. A former head of the National Union of Students, the Labour MP, Wes Streeting, has accused ministers of mis-selling loans to students. The original plan was to regularly increase the repayment threshold, currently set at earnings of £21,000 a year. But last year, the government announced that the threshold would be frozen. Attempting to amend the Higher Education and Research Bill, Wes Streeting said banks would not get away with making these sorts of changes.
Students and their families were sold these loans on the basis of a series of simple promises by government ministers. They'll only be repaid once you leave university. They'll only be repaid once you start earning over £21,000 a year. You'll repay 9% of everything earned above £21,000 a year. And the good news is that from April 2017, the £21,000 figure will be uprated each year in line with average earnings. But around this time last year, in the fine print of the previous Chancellor's autumn statement, was buried an announcement that the repayment threshold will in fact be frozen at £21,000. As a result, graduates will end up paying more each month and thousands of pounds more over the 30-year lifetime of their loans.
It was under the last Labour government that Parliament was invited to confirm, as it did, that student loans were exempt from regulation under the Consumer Credit Act, when the then Labour government passed the Sale of Student Loans Act. So the honourable member should look back at his own party's record on this issue.
A Lib Dem MP referred to the financial journalist Martin Lewis, who's campaigned on this issue.
What we have currently is nothing short of a scandal with the raising of the threshold, because a contract has been broken. A one-sided redefinition of the terms of the loan. And in any other context, as Martin Lewis has quite correctly said, this would lead to legal action. It's only possible, the reason why legal action is not possible is because of the small print, which as far as most undergraduates concerned, was very, very small indeed.
John Pugh there. In the end, the amendment was defeated by 98 votes. You're watching Monday in Parliament. Our top story. The government has defended the independent child sex abuse inquiry after one of the groups representing survivors withdrew its cooperation. A Labour MP is calling on the government to set up a royal commission to look into the provision of early years education and childcare. Helen Jones was opening a debate following an e-petition which objected to what the petitioners called inequality in the system. The government currently pays for 15 hours of free care for all 3- and 4-year-olds and wants to increase that to 30 hours a week for most from next autumn. It also provides free childcare to 2-year-olds from the poorest families. Helen Jones said many parents were angry at the cost they had to pay, which had risen by 30% between 2010 and 2015, and increased 5 times higher than the rise in wages.
One lady who contacted me from the Northwest said that her family are paying £840 a month for 3 days a week childcare. Now, they are not highly paid, and to put it into context, that is exactly the same amount as their mortgage payment.
She reckoned without proper funding, nurseries would struggle to provide the 30 hours of free care the government wanted.
At the moment, if a parent has, say, 40 hours childcare a week, 15 hours are paid by the local authority, but at a fairly low rate. The hours that a parent takes are paid at a higher rate to cross-subsidise the others. Now, if the government does not fund the extra hours properly, there are several things that could happen. First of all, the quality can reduce, or many providers may not take part in the scheme at all, or there will be a further cost on parents because providers decide to charge more for other types of childcare that the parent buys them, childcare for under-2s, holiday provision, out-of-hours provision. And I think that the government should look very seriously at this and should set up an inquiry, perhaps under Royal Commission terms, staffed by experts. I know some members of the government don't like experts, but you really do need experts in this. They're experts because they know something about it. That inquiry should do several things. It should chart a path to, if not free early years provision, at least heavily subsidised early years provision.
Nurseries have been very clear, both in the conversations I've had, but in writing to all members of the House, that this cocktail of funding pressures will ultimately push them into an unsustainable financial situation. The Honourable Member for Warrington North has referred to this very eloquently in her own speech. I hope the Minister today will put an end to this uncertainty and immediately commit to funding to guarantee that nursery schools have a long-term future. In the Labour Party, we believe that working parents are bearing the burden of the government, demanding unachievable expansion in provision at the same time as woeful underfunding.
While welcoming the Honourable Lady to her place, I know that she's quite new in government. I would very gently like to say to her there was absolutely nothing positive, there was nothing constructive in anything that she said. I didn't get at any point the sense that she wants to work with me to make this work. All she wanted to do was make cheap political points in the name of the Labour Party. She may as well have been dressed as a great big red rose that stood there today. In addition to various other policies which help many of the issues that have been described today, such as the flexible working, allowing people to access flexible working, the shared parental leave, which was never introduced under the former Labour government, and Mr Paisley, over £6 billion on childcare by 2019-20 in cash terms. That is more, I know she's not listening to this, but that is more than any other government ever has spent on this issue. £6 billion a year on childcare by 2020, including an extra £1 billion into the free early years entitlement.
The government, she insisted, was taking action to help solve the problem. Now, it was only a year ago that the government produced a national security strategy, setting out the threats facing the UK and how to tackle them. But in the light of the vote to leave the EU and Russian aggression, several peers argued that the strategy was already out of date.
Russia is growing in intent and in capability. We are not only not matching that, we are shrinking. We do not have enough numbers in the RN and the RAF to get banded properly our equipment we have today. Brexit is surely going to demand that we are prepared to operate more autonomously. Surely the government must realise that STSR 15 is not fit for purpose.
The question is whether the concept that we set out in the SDSR, the Joint Force 2025 concept, is the right choice for the current strategic context. We are clear that it is. It is a concept that is about making more effective use of our armed forces because it both invests in new capabilities and makes better use of the people that we have. Now, of course,
the SDSR referred to there is the Strategic Defence and Security Review. Another peer took an equally grim view.
The world has changed. It's only a year, but we think as what has happened has changed. As far as I'm concerned, I think we're living in the most troublesome times I can think of in my lifetime, having lived both through the war and also during the confrontation with Russia. I would suggest, and I have asked, that we could have a full defence review, a defence debate in this House, to have permission to have one, because I think this is the most serious subject. I think the demands on our armed services as to what's happening in Europe and what is happening as well with what's happening with the United States of America is such. I would ask my noble friend the Minister whether he would agree that the situation has changed and the demands could be greater in the years to come.
Yeah. My Lords, I'm sure that my noble friend's request will not have fallen on deaf ears as regards the usual channels, and I'd be happy to speak to him after this about the possibility of a debate on these matters. We are not complacent about Russian capabilities, about the political changes in the United States, or about Brexit. We remain, however, fully committed to NATO and our European partners, with whom we will deter threats across a wide spectrum in order to protect our people.
Our defence is supported by a skilled civil service. So would the Minister confirm whether the SDSR commitment to reduce MOD staff by 30% by 2020 is still on track? And what proportion does the government anticipate will be carrying out the same role, but with a new employer?
It's too early for me to answer the last part of the Noble Baroness's question, but I would acknowledge that the last few percentage points in that 30% target are challenging. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, what we are impressing on our people is that to the extent that they are able to save money from a reduction in the civil service headcount, all that money is ploughed back into the defence budget under the efficiency agreement with the Treasury.
Well, it's the comfortable words about our defence forces, I'm afraid, just won't wash. And what I'm delighted about within this chamber and in the other places, there is a growing groundswell of people who understand that we have not got sufficiently strong defence forces. That awareness actually is now growing in the public at large.
I recognise the concerns that the Noble Lord has, and it's no use denying we live in a more dangerous and troublesome world. I come back to the Joint Force 2025 concept. It is a long-term programme, but it is designed to enable our armed forces to respond to a wider range of more sophisticated potential adversaries and complex real-world challenges. I believe that that is the right direction in which to go.
Now, senior figures from the Health Department in England have been questioned by MPs over the failure to recover £500 million from overseas visitors who use the NHS. The financial watchdog, the National Audit Office, has said the amount charged is likely to fall short of £350 million by 2017 to 18. The top civil servant at the department was challenged in particular over the failure to charge for treatment given to citizens of the European Economic Area, the EEA, which covers the European Union plus countries such as Norway.
We are light years away from achieving 200 million, aren't we, Mr. Whittle? This is not going to be met, is it?
Well, as I say, if we do the changes that we want to make, and we have not been running this programme for very long, we do believe that we can get our current trajectory, which has been said is around about 350 million, up towards that 500 million.
Are we going to make the 200 million from EEA, yes or no?
I'm not going to guarantee that we will make that 200 million because it's dependent on a whole range of factors. What we're doing... Sorry, I mean, yes, I mean, just as a statement of fact, I can't guarantee.
My point I'm making is it seems that basically no progress has been made and the whole thing is a complete shambles.
Sorry, we're talking about a situation where we've gone overall from collecting about 80 million a year to collecting about 280 million a year.
But on the EEA, we're not making any progress at all.
Well, with the bit we have targeted, because actually that number is, some of it is numbers driven around the other schemes. The actual EHIC bit has gone up from us identifying about 5,000 treatments a year to us identifying about 18,000 treatments a year under EHIC over 2 years. Now, we haven't seen that show through in the cash amounts yet. We do expect that to go up. Are we going to get to 200? Well, as you have said, that is clearly a tough ask given where we are right now. But we're going to keep at it.
I took a French cousin of mine to my local hospital last Christmas. They were not on the NHS system because they are not resident here and they are therefore not going to be in it. And my hospital asked them for identification, which was provided. The broken bone was fixed. I assume that my hospital were then able to bill France for that treatment. But are you telling me that that actually is not standard procedure across every hospital in the land, that if you turn up and you're not, because you're not a local person on the NHS register, on that system, this is a difficult thing to follow through on? Is that what you're telling me? This is not absolutely standard practice, that if you know, I'm not saying anyone's going to be charged, but you don't find it possible to identify that individual?
Well, I mean, clearly not. I mean, the numbers, as various people around the committee have
So we're treating patients who we have not identified?
Yes. Not in
large
not
numbers.
In those sets. It is quite clear from the numbers and the expectations we've set and the research we did in 2013, that there are patients who should be charged who are not currently being identified.
But are not identified at the point of arrival at the hospital in order for us to follow that through?
Yeah, that are not identified as being a patient who should be charged.
But if he's not on the NHS system with a British NHS number, by definition, that patient probably will be in that category.
No, you can. Those individuals may well are the most likely to be identified, but an NHS number does not prove eligibility. Anyone can get an NHS number.
No, but then you can follow that through. You have an identifiable marker attached to that cost, that treatment cost.
Yeah, this is the IT change we were describing earlier. We can now track that through the system, so it should become easier. But has it been standard practice? No, it hasn't.
And that's all from us for now. Keith McDougall's here for the rest of the week, but from me, Joanna Shin, goodbye.